The latest theory of cancer is that a normal cell becomes cancerous when it undergoes several phases of genetic mutations in one or more genes that regulate vital processes. In other words, a mutation is a change in cell DNA that may or may not be beneficial to our body. In this video, we will look at the 10 phases that lead to cells becoming super powerful, the so-called cancer cells. Phase 1. One of the potential mutations is uncontrolled cell division. Cell division is usually a normal cell process. When the cell ends the division process, it should rest until its turn comes round again. But with cancer, it resumes division immediately. Phase 2. Another change is the ability of the tumour cell to somehow manage to nullify the order to stop dividing. Phase 3. Another characteristic that the tumour cell manages to annul is the activation of cellular suicide, thereby making apoptosis impossible. Apoptosis is an essential cellular process for the development of plants and animals. In the tissues of a healthy human being, every hour, billions of cells activate a program of intracellular death by unknown cellular mechanisms. This process is also known as programmed cell death. Phase 4. Another feature that the cell manages to gain through mutation is an ability to prevent premature aging. A cell will do this by producing telomerase, the enzyme that repairs telomeres. In other words, the cell will become immortal. Phase 5. We now have a cell that can multiply uncontrollably. To maintain this, it needs to find a way to feed using a different metabolism than a normal cell. It will start to use less oxygen and more glucose. This cell, after having multiplied and increased in volume, will start to have areas without blood vessels and blood supply. This will cause those cells to then die, not by a process of apoptosis, but by a process of necrosis. Necrosis is an accidental death of cells and is triggered after trauma, lack of blood supply, or acute injury, among other factors. Necrotic cells expand and either rupture or dissolve their plasma membrane or bacterial wall, which leads to death and consequent release of its content. This will cause an inflammatory response, which does not happen in apoptosis. Phase 6. And why is it that at this point, the tumour does not die or stop growing? Because tumours learn to create new blood vessels through a process called angiogenesis. Phase 7. Another characteristic that tumours develop is a disguise that allows them to hide from the immune system. And even though science today does not yet understand how it achieves this, it is one of the ways used to fight cancer, also known as immunotherapy. Phase 8. Inflammation is another consequence of malignant cells, but how do malignant cells stimulate inflammation? We do not know yet, but this inflammation supports the evolution of the disease. Phase 9. At this phase, the cancer cells first invade neighbouring tissue and then enter the nearest blood vessels, thereby moving and spreading throughout the body. This is perhaps one of the most well-known characteristics of cancer. As they move to other tissues, the multiplication process continues. This process is called metastasis. However, the peculiar thing is that most cancers originate in the epithelia. The epithelial cells are lodged within the body's internal cavities. These have very little or no freedom of movement because they form barriers between tissues and protect our internal structure. These are the primary tumours and organs where metastases usually show up. Phase 10. The final characteristic that is typical of a malignant cell is a fragile DNA. Despite a large number of mechanisms to stop mutations, a fragile DNA ultimately leads to errors occurring more frequently and easily, leading to chain reactions. Some studies use this characteristic to explain the frequency of mutations, but the latest research is inconclusive. This concludes our explanation of cancer cells and how they behave. Now we must ask, how can such a complex process give rise to such a common disease? Is this really how cancer develops? Or is the current theory about cancer wrong, leading us down a path of choosing the wrong treatment? See the next video, The Cancer Lottery.